Hallo und herzlich willkommen bei WeTalk, dem Gesprächsformat der Werteinitiative rund ums Thema jüdisches Leben in Deutschland. Mein Name ist Maja Vattermann und ich führe Sie durch den heutigen WeTalk. Kein Staat auf der Welt wird so oft verurteilt wie Israel in den Vereinten Nationen. Die Anlässe und Themen dabei wirken oft absurd und werden oft von israelfeindlichen Staaten eingebracht. Doch Deutschland stimmt regelmäßig mit ab, und zwar regelmäßig für die Anträge, mit denen Israel verurteilt wird. Ein Verhalten, was über 90% der befragten jüdischen Bürgerinnen und Bürger durch die Werteinitiative als irritierend empfunden wird. Daher ist das deutsche Abstimmungsverfahren das Gesprächsthema des heutigen WeTalks. Heute bei uns zu Gast der Geschäftsführer der NGO UN-Watch, Hillel Neuer. Wir haben uns darauf verständigt, das Gespräch auf Englisch zu führen. Thank you for being here, Hillel. In order to introduce you and your organization to the viewers, could you please tell us what is the mission of UN Watch and what is your personal mission?
Well, thank you for having me, and happy to speak about UN Watch, which was established nearly 30 years ago in Geneva, Switzerland, by a great human rights figure, Morris Abram. He was an American civil rights leader. He worked arm in arm with Martin Luther King Jr. in the fight for the equal treatment of Black people in America. He helped win an important Supreme Court case giving equal treatment for Black people so they would have the vote in the American South. And then he was named eventually United States Ambassador to the Human Rights Commission in Geneva. He was the permanent representative of the United States. And then he retired, and he had the idea to create the first independent body that would monitor the United Nations according to the principles of the United Nations Charter. That charter represents the noble values of liberal internationalism, international peace, security, fundamental freedoms for all. Unfortunately, there are too many members of the United Nations today which are dictatorships, which are human rights violators, and they hijack these principles and they try to use the good name of the United Nations to abuse it, to give themselves immunity, and to single out Israel. UN Watch was created to fight back, to uphold the original principles of the United Nations, and I would say that's my personal mission as well.
So the UN was initially established as the keeper of world peace, as a defender of human rights. Why is then there a need of an organization which is monitoring what they are doing?
Well, every institution of government, as the founders of the United States taught us, needs checks and balances. And it was principles that were developed here in Europe. And in a well-functioning democracy like Germany, like Canada, where I come from, or Switzerland, where I live, there are various institutions of government that hold the other in checks and balances. You have a legislature, but if the legislature does something wrong, you have an independent judiciary, which can sometimes hold the government to account. You have free and fair elections. You have independent media. You have various institutions. The United Nations, you have none of those controls. So if 100 member states decide that Russia should be on the Human Rights Council, they elected Russia. They'd elected China. They elected Cuba, Venezuela, Eritrea, Pakistan, Libya. Some of the world's worst violators of human rights were chosen by a decision of the majority of the General Assembly. And there was no one to stop them. There's no one to hold them to account. So although the principles of the United Nations, as you mentioned, are noble, they are to protect human rights, they are to promote peace and security, there's no one there to stop UN bodies when they do something that actually violates their own principles. And so we at UN Watch are an independent organization. We're a monitoring body. We actually have accreditation as a non-governmental organization. We have status as an observer at the UN. And our role is to remind the UN to hold the institution to account when certain of its non-democratic, anti-democratic members try to steer it and hijack it in the wrong way.
So let's talk about the UN votings regarding the state of Israel. What are your main observations when it comes to resolutions about Israel in the UN?
Well, look, I think every country should be scrutinized. and held to account. It's what makes, here in Germany, it's a healthy democracy because you have citizens and institutions, political parties, free press, independent activists who hold the government to account. So I think Israel is healthier because it has the same things. It has freedom of the press, it has a vigorous, hyper-democratic Knesset, it has a very activist, interventionist judiciary holding the government to account, striking down decisions or laws. And what we see at the United Nations is not a healthy treatment of Israel, but the opposite. We see an obsession, I would say a pathological obsession, with demonizing Israel. And I'll give you an example. At the General Assembly in New York, which is the world's parliament, every year there's one resolution on Iran, one on North Korea, one on Syria, and 15 on Israel. That makes no sense. That makes the notion that a country that is barely, not even 1% of the world's population, of the planet, of the space on the world's planet, and actually a democracy, imperfect, but the best bastion of democracy in the entire Middle East, that would be condemned 15 times more than North Korea, that is absurd. And so we see in Geneva at the Human Rights Council, there is one agenda item at every meeting for the whole world. It's called Human Rights Situations Around the World, agenda item 4. And then they come to agenda item 7, which is human rights violations in Palestine and other occupied Arab territories, meaning Israel. One agenda item at every meeting on the world, one on Israel. There is no agenda item on Syria, on North Korea, on Sudan, only on Israel. That's discrimination. Finally, I would mention that also in Geneva, there is now a commission of inquiry that's supposed to look into whether there's discrimination, systematic discrimination based on race, religion in Israel and the Palestinian territories. The person who's heading the inquiry, who was appointed as the chair, is a woman named Navi Pillay, and she has actually signed petitions to governments calling on them to, and I'm quoting, sanction apartheid Israel. So the head of the inquiry, the chief judge, who's supposed to investigate, is there discrimination in Israel or in the Palestinian territories? She says that Israel's an apartheid state. She is lobbying governments actively to sanction apartheid Israel. The notion that she could be an independent and impartial judge is beyond laughable, it's absurd, and it's wrong. So these are 3 examples of how the United Nations is being abused. Its good name, its authority, its credibility is being abused by dictatorships to target, to demonize, to criminalize Israel. And democracies like Germany and other European states should stand up and say, no, this is wrong.
So what is your role when it comes to this elected people who shouldn't be in their positions? What are you doing then?
Well, an example is Russia. I mentioned a couple of years ago, the United Nations General Assembly elected new members to the Human Rights Council. They elected China, they elected Russia, they elected Cuba. These are among the world's worst violators. China throws political prisoners, throws dissidents into prison. They have 1 million Uyghurs herded into camps. Russia, we know what they're doing in Ukraine, killing innocent people. They poison their own dissidents. Cuba throws artists in prison. It's a communist dictatorship. These countries should never have been elected to the Human Rights Council. We opposed them. We brought their victims to speak to the United Nations, to meet with journalists, to tell diplomats, don't vote for my oppressor. But they did, and they were elected. But we didn't give up. When Russia invaded Ukraine, we spearheaded the campaign, acting under Article 8 of Resolution 60/251, which says a country that commits gross and systematic abuses of human rights can be suspended. We called to suspend Vladimir Putin's regime. That got picked up. America picked it up, and they brought it to a vote, and more than a strong majority removed Russia from the Human Rights Council, and we're glad that in this case we helped to spearhead that campaign.
So as we are in Germany, in Berlin today, we would like to focus on Germany's role in these votings. What do you think about it?
Well, I think Germany in some ways votes against biased resolutions. We saw just last week the World Health Organization dealing with pandemics and dealing with viruses and global health emergencies, took a pause from all of that for several hours to focus on condemning Israel. Every year, the World Health Assembly has a debate focusing on attacking Israel. The resolution is singling out Israel. And Germany voted no. They took a principled stand. They joined the Netherlands, the UK, Canada, other democracies. They voted no. Some other European countries, like France, voted yes, which was shameful. So in this case, Germany did the right thing. Also, we had a conference called Durban 4, which was an anniversary, the 20th anniversary of the infamous Durban Conference on Racism in Durban, South Africa in 2001, which became an infamous anti-Semitic event. When the anniversary event was held in September of 2021, Germany took a principled stand with other European democracies. They pulled out of that event. So Germany did the right thing there. Also in the General Assembly in New York, Germany has begun slightly to change their votes to, in some cases, vote no. However, having said all that, which is important, Germany still supports, I'd say about 70% of the one-sided resolutions against Israel. There might be 13, 14, 15 against Israel. Germany supports most of them, abstains on others. Maybe on one or two they vote no, but it's very few. So they give the signal that these resolutions are okay. Singling out Israel is okay. So too at Geneva at the Human Rights Council, 3 out of the 4 resolutions, Germany votes yes. Germany will say that, well, we're negotiating, we're engaging to try to improve the language of the resolutions. That may be the case. But at the end of the day, when you see the vote and you see that the worst dictatorships are voting against Israel, and you have sometimes Austria, Czech Republic voting no, you have India, Bahrain abstaining or absent, and Germany votes yes with dictatorships, that's wrong. So I think there's still a lot of room for Germany to improve their voting record and to take the principled stand at the United Nations that reflects German democratic values.
So I would like to pick up on that. Former German Foreign Minister Heiko Maas once explained in the Bundestag that the votes on anti-Israel resolutions are, from his perspective, an attempt to influence the debate. And instead of going out of the debate early, they want to weaken the resolution's text. That's what you also mentioned right now.
Yeah.
So is there some kind of, reasoning behind that?
Yes. Do I think it's justified? Yes, indeed. The German government's argument is that we need to vote yes because we are part of a dialogue with the Palestinians. We encourage them to soften the language, to remove certain provisions. And in order for us to make the language better, we must stay in the process and we must vote yes. And it's all for a good purpose. I'm not sure if I buy that, to be honest. I appreciate Germany's efforts and their intentions, but the result is a public statement to the world. Everyone is looking. When you see the voting sheet, the whole world sees it. Everyone understands that how you vote publicly is your stance to the world. And when Germany votes yes to resolutions that are one-sided, disproportionate, that say nothing about Hamas terrorism, Islamic Jihad, rockets, stabbings, knifings, people taking an axe, killing Israelis, as we saw in the past few months, if Germany votes yes to these one-sided resolutions, it's sending the wrong message. And I think Germany should take a principled stand. The United States does it. Canada does it. In Geneva, the British government does it. The Czech government has done it sometimes. Austria, Australia. Germany should take a principled position. There's a message they're sending. There's a signal. They should vote no and take a principled stand.
So would you say this would be an accurate behavior from Germany, just to vote no?
I think if enough countries voted no, the Palestinians would not bring these resolutions. Germany's argument is that we engage with them, we negotiate, they make them a bit softer, and so that's a good result.
But they are also aligned with other European countries which do the same.
Yes, absolutely. Right? I don't want to single out Germany. There are a number of other European countries who have this approach. And one may question, they say, well, it's the Palestinians bringing them, but it seems that some of these resolutions, these European countries like these resolutions. If they didn't, they would vote no. So I think it might be a bit of an excuse to say, well, the Palestinians bring them and we have no choice. We have to engage with them. I think it's a bit of a dance and it takes two to tango. So European countries in general don't seem to object so strongly to these resolutions. They tell us that they are softening them, but the real way to stop them, if the European countries, I would say the European Union holds very significant legitimacy. Countries around the world in Africa, in South America, in Asia, look to how the EU votes. And that's kind of an indication of where democracies ought to vote. The US is kind of a bit special, but how the EU votes, that's a good indicator. It pulls in many other countries. If the EU is voting yes to anti-Israel resolutions, that signals to other countries to do the same. If the EU would vote no, 1 time, 2 times, 3 times, to all of these resolutions that are imbalanced, if it's balanced, that's fine. You want to criticize Israel, you also criticize Mr. Abbas for his crushing of journalists and students, oppressing his own people, condemn Hamas, Islamic Jihad. If you have a fair resolution, Germany can vote yes. But one-sided resolutions, Germany, France, the Netherlands, Italy, they should vote no, and then the resolutions would stop. The Palestinians do not want to bring resolutions and have the EU saying no to them. So actually, if Germany wants to put a stop to it, they, with their European allies, should vote no.
So what do you think, what is the real deal behind the voting behavior from Germany's position? Why can't they, or why aren't they doing it right? You know, it sounds, you said it's like a dance, a tango, and why? Why is it?
Well, the resolutions normally are introduced by the Palestinians with the help of the Arab group of 22 countries and the Muslim group of 56 countries, represented often by Pakistan. And Germany goes along with them. Why does Germany go along with them? Well, you could say part of it is realpolitik. Germany may want support from 56 Muslim states at the UN. That's political support. You vote for me, I vote for you, 56 votes. Number 2, oil. All European countries still want access to Arab oil, which used to be a weapon on these things. Historically, there was trade. If you don't vote along with the Arab states, maybe you don't get billions of dollars of investment. Fear of terrorism. If you don't vote with the Arab resolutions, maybe your country will be targeted. And I think there's also some other reasons that some countries seem content to single out the Jewish state and to say if we have human rights problems in the world, let's scapegoat the Jewish country, the Jew among the nations. I think that can be a factor as well when we look at how European countries vote, unfortunately.
Just a few weeks ago, I had the chance to interview Jeremy Zaharov, the former ambassador to Germany from Israel. And there is a kind of discrepancy that you two described. Like, he was really positive about German-Israeli relationships, and he was really proud of what we established after the Second World War. And if I listen to your opinion, it's really different what you explained. What do you think, where comes this discrepancy from?
Well, I didn't hear the interview with the former ambassador, so I can't comment on it. And if he's talking about the relationship as a whole, today we've just been discussing voting at the UN. The relationship as a whole, obviously Germany is a friend of Israel, and Chancellor Merkel was a friend of Israel and helped Israel in many important ways, including certain important UN votes and including providing important help with submarines and other things. It's a very significant and important relationship, and Germany has been a friend to Israel, of course. But if you ask me in Geneva, when there are 4 resolutions on Israel, and the United States votes no against every one, and Austria might vote no, and Brazil might vote no, and Bahrain might abstain, and Germany and other EU countries will vote yes on 3 out of 4 of the resolutions, the facts speak for themselves. So the relationship is much larger than the UN voting. And obviously, Israel and Germany have a very close relationship, an important relationship. But there is a problem with the UN voting. And I don't know if the ambassador, how he saw it, but it speaks for itself. And the resolutions, we have a website, unwatch.org/database. unwatch.org/database. One can go in there, see all the resolutions. One can go under countries, type in Germany, see how Germany voted, and the facts speak for themselves.
Jeremy Zaharov was involved in the signing of the Abraham Accords. What do you think? How could the situation maybe improve with the Abraham Accords and the considerations made for the Arabic states?
Yeah, look, the Abraham Accords are very significant. For the first time, Israel has a warm relationship. They had peace, a cold peace with Egypt and Jordan, but it really was a very cold peace. Members of civil society, journalists from Egypt cannot go to Israel. They get banned from their unions. And there remains very harsh hostility in society in Jordan and Egypt against Israelis. And I would say anti-Semitism as well, even if the governments are cooperating a lot on security and other issues. The peace and normalization with the Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco is very different. It's very affectionate, public displays of affection, enthusiastic, tens of thousands of Israelis going to the Emirates, high-level Emiratis coming to Israel, and significant trade, hundreds of millions of dollars of trade in a very short period of time. So I think the Abraham Accords are very significant. And there's also, it's a whole approach. If in Hamas, it's a nihilistic approach, looking towards how to destroy and taking the best Arab minds and using it on how to build bombs and kill Israelis. In the Emirates, it's the opposite. They're future-looking, they're progressive-looking, they're trying to build a future society, and that very much in sync with where Israel is and with a startup nation. So I think that represents a great future. If you ask me, have we seen it yet at the United Nations in the voting? Not yet. And I think it'll take some time. I mentioned a year ago, Bahrain was absent on one of the votes. You could read that as a kind of abstention, but for the most part, they're voting the way they always did. And there are many countries that have had friendly relations with Israel for many years, but vote against Israel because 56 Muslim countries will give them their vote because of oil, and they're afraid to do it. So I think it's not reasonable to expect the Abraham Accords developments and progress and achievements to be reflected at the UN so quickly, but I hope over time that we will see it. And there indeed have been some speeches made by the Emiratis and Bahrainis talking about peace. There was a joint statement that was done in Geneva, the Human Rights Council, with the Emirati, Bahrain, Morocco, and Israeli ambassadors on a separate issue about conflict resolution. So I think we're not there yet, but there is some hope.
That's a good ending.
Good.
Thank you, Hillel, for these insights. I learned a lot, and I'm sure that the viewers did so too. Das war We Talk, das Gesprächsformat der Werteinitiative rund um jüdisches Leben in Deutschland. Wenn Sie mehr über die Werteinitiative erfahren wollen, folgen Sie uns auf den sozialen Kanälen und unserer Webseite und abonnieren Sie gerne unseren Newsletter. Bis bald!